All right, you ready for this?
Ready.
Hey everybody, this is Tom Salemi of Device Talks. Welcome back to the Device Talks, a weekly podcast. We have a somewhat abbreviated episode of the Device Talks weekly podcast. No Chris Newmarker this week, no newsmakers of any kind. Well, we have newsmakers, but not in that sort of podcasty sense. We have an interview that I did with John McCutcheon, who is the CEO and president of EBR Systems. EBR Systems is making a very cool wireless pacemaker-like device for the left ventricle, and John will get into why that's important in this episode. I wanted to talk with John because I wanted to catch up with him at EBR, but I also knew John from his previous company 2 companies back. John and I started talking probably 15, 20 years ago when he was CEO of Emphasys Medical. And I didn't initially intend to have this interview timed with Medtronic's disappointing news this week about the advisory committee's decision not to recommend approval of Medtronic's Symplicity renal denervation device. But it did remind me of an experience that we'd had in 2008 when an advisory committee voted against approving Emphasys Medical's Zephyr bronchial valve, which was for emphysema. So back then, there were a number of interventional pulmonology companies that were developing devices and technologies that could help patients who had diminished lung capacity. And there was a lot of hope and promise around it. And while there was some clinical success, Emphasys Medical's came up against an advisory board that John can explain better than I. At the time, the environment around the FDA was very politically charged, and there was a lot of consternation, a lot of, I don't want to say animosity, but the FDA wasn't working as well with the medical device industry as it is today. And 2008 was probably a lower point, if not the low point. So John was CEO of Emphasys Medical. Emphasys Medical went before an advisory board committee, got a negative vote, even though it had met its clinical endpoints. And again, John we'll get into this in the conversation. And that really, led to a lot of different things. It led to Emphasys Medical ultimately being sold to a rival company, Pulmonx, which would 10 years later eventually get the FDA approval necessary for the Zephyr valve. But it also causes the medical device industry to really look inward, to really question whether or not investing in devices made sense if there seemed to be some sort of capricious approach by the FDA, or at least an unpredictable approach. I don't want to say capricious, an unpredictable FDA that you really couldn't project whether or not a device had a chance of approval, even if it had data that supported it. So after Emphasys Medical came to an end, John McCutcheon was very honest about his disappointment back then, as were a lot of the investors. And that sort of, again, led to a groundswell of questions from industry that led to Josh Mackauer conducting a survey of the industry that led to conversations with the FDA. Jeff Shern came in, and that all led to the FDA relationship that we have today, which is markedly better. I can't find anyone who would speak ill of the agency anymore. Yes, there's requirements for data. Yes, sometimes the bar seems higher than it need be, but I haven't heard anyone wring their hands or express any concerns about the FDA like they used to. So John McCutcheon's story at Emphasys Medical just reminded me of what Medtronic might be going through this week, even though the environment is different, the broader environment is different. When you have a product that you're working on for years and it goes before a board and you think you have the information you need, the data you need to get approval, and then you don't, sort of what happens next. Medtronic is going to push forward and try to work with the FDA to get some level of approval for the Medtronic for the Symplicity renal denervation device. Renal denervation is another technology that I covered back at that time when it was already even before that with the Foundry, through the acquisition by Medtronic. So it's another long time story that we were sort of hoping, I was hoping would come to a positive outcome. And it doesn't appear to be there yet. We'll see what happens. So John can share his experiences as CEO of Emphasys Medical, but we didn't obviously focus on just that. I did apologize for bringing it up again to John because I just feel like I keep asking him to relive this bad experience. But as you'll hear, John has completely moved on. He's glad that Pulmonx acquired the Zephyr, glad that they got approval for it, glad that he can contribute to somehow to helping people with emphysema live more comfortable lives. But he's now entirely focused on EBS. And in between that, he led Ceterix to an acquisition by Smith and Nephew. So John's fine. He's doing great. Super nice man. And EBR Systems is really just got a really, really cool device that I know you'll appreciate learning more about. So again, I wasn't, when I initially planned on talking with John, it wasn't to connect Emphasys Medical's experience to what Medtronic is going through today. But I did talk to him this week, and then the Medtronic news came out, and it just seemed like a good opportunity to bring, to contribute to the discussion about industry's relationship with the FDA through a bit of a history lesson with Emphasys Medical. So I'm really grateful to John McCutcheon for his time and for the time he took not only to relive the Emphasys story, but also to introduce me to EBR. I wasn't really aware of it, what his story was. And it's one of these longtime medtech stories that may take a while to find its way onto the market. But once it does, it could help a lot of people. And that's one of the medtech industries and folks with the medtech industry, one of their greater qualities is their resiliency and their desire to stick with something until it gets to where it needs to be. So hope you enjoy this conversation with John McCutcheon. But before we go, please do join us at Device Talks West. It's happening October 18th and 19th. Seriously, it's going to be a great 2 days. The agenda is shaped up nicely. I'm so excited. I can't wait to see folks and talk about medical devices and product development. And it's just going to be a powerful way for you to improve your skill sets, to expand your network, and to have some fun. We're going to have some fun. We'll have networking on the 17th, and then 2 days of conferences on the 18th and 19th at the Santa Clara Convention Center. So please go to devicetalks.com to register for that. And while you're there, register for our upcoming Device Talks Tuesdays, which is happening this Tuesday at 4 p.m. And it's sponsored by our friends at S3 Connected Health. I brought this up before. They were our very first paying sponsor for Device Talks Tuesday, and they've been back every year to do one, and they always do a great job. The title is Digital Health Innovation for MedTech, from Concept to Commercialization. Bill Betton, Director of Solutions of S3 Connected Health, will be there. So will Randy Schissel. He is COO of Voxy Health. So this will be a conversation light on the PowerPoint, heavy on the conversation, heavy on questions from the audience. So bring your problems, bring your questions. You'll find some solutions at Device Talks Tuesday. Go to devicetalks.com to register for that. You can watch it live at 4 p.m. Eastern on Tuesday, or you can watch it on demand. But we'd love to have you there live. We'd love to ask your questions to the panel and get you the answers that you need. All right. With all that being said, thanks for allowing me to walk down memory lane. Now let's talk with John McCutcheon, the CEO of EBR Systems. Well, John McCutcheon, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Tom. Thanks so much for having me.
Excited to learn the EBR story. I've been following your exploits in medtech for a number of years now. Lots of interesting stories there, but first, let's hear your story. What was your first job in medtech? What drew you to the industry?
First job in medtech was Bentley Laboratories, which was a division of American Hospital Supply before it was acquired by Baxter. Mm-hmm. So I got a job in sales out of college. It was a training program. I was living in Southern California, and they had a program. They'd say, well, we'll train you in the technology and in sales, but you have to agree to be relocated to an open territory. So I was young and single and adventurous, and so did that. And for 3 months later, they shipped me off to Florida. Wow. And I had the Tampa area. It kind of actually covered most of Florida. and sold oxygenators, cardiopulmonary equipment, and the Edwards heart valve. That was my front end exposure. Got to see what happened, at the hospital level, at the physician level, and it really satisfied my curiosity about, kind of getting into the medical business, understanding how medical device purchase decisions are made. It was intimidating. I was a young 20 something, and I'm selling heart valves to CV surgeons.
I bet.
At the beginning, it's like, I was just a kid. What can I sell them? But after a while, you kind of learn, they're just people too. And you learn that you have the domain or the deep experience on the product.
Yeah.
No, you're not the doctor. And it's a really good introduction, I think, into the industry for me.
And that company was a good training ground for a lot of medtech execs, right?
Yeah.
What was it about working? Yeah. What was it about that environment?
It was a startup before startups were cool, right? So Bentley Labs was a startup in probably, I don't know the year it was founded, but it would have been likely in the 70s, I'm thinking. But at that point, it was more mature. And I saw my career there. At first, I thought, well, maybe I'll go corporate. This is, is ambitious, and this could be a corporate path. But what I realized along the way there was that you have to really manage up in a corporation. And where I get my passion is kind of where the rubber meets the road. It's the customer, the technology. And this is not to knock anybody who this is their career path. It's different for everybody. But the higher you go in the corporation, it feels to me like you lose that touch point. And so I had friends that were working at DVI up in Northern California at the time. And that's when I transitioned from Baxter into the startup world.
Interesting. So did you know at the time that was where your energy was going to be coming from, the startup world, or was there a question mark?
At the beginning, it was not an intent. I thought corporate seemed like a great path. And then as I wore that badge for a little bit, it became more apparent that entrepreneurship was my calling. And then when I got to DVI, that just confirmed it. And that's what I've been doing ever since. And that's been, 40 plus or almost 40 years.
So you ultimately rose to a CEO role. You were a CEO at Emphasys Medical. That was your first CEO role.
That's right. That's where you and I first got acquainted. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So what was it about? Had you always had that as part of your plan to lead a company?
Yeah, I was very ambitious, and I wanted to work my way up. And so PerClose was probably the opportunity that got me close to being able to become a CEO. Work my way from a marketing manager, director of marketing, up to eventually VP sales and marketing, global VP sales and marketing, but always wanted to be in that general management CEO role. I really had that ambition. So it was a very focused strategy to get there.
How does the skill set you get being VP of sales and marketing translate into running a company where you have no sales and nothing to market?
Yeah, it is an interesting transition. Well, I think when you're in a marketing role in particular, you get exposure to all the various departments. And so I've always been very curious and not just try not to be funneled in my functional domain when I was in sales and marketing. So you get very involved with R&D, with manufacturing, production, forecasting, understanding there's a back order. Why is there a back order? What's going on in the manufacturing process? You interface with finance. And so and at PerClose, Hank Plain was the CEO, and he really treated me as a partner, and he was a great mentor. And so I had a seat at the table at everything that was happening. I was involved in the IPO at PerClose and did a lot of the pitches to the bankers. So I got a lot of broad exposure that really set me up well to be, a CEO, and really, again, what I think of as a general manager, not just a functional, siloed domain expert.
Interesting. Well, let's talk a little bit about Emphasys. It's a story, like you said, that's where we first started talking, and I was covering your company's technology, which we can get into a little bit. It was in the pulmonary space, but more intimately, we talked about your interactions with the FDA. And I feel like every time we reconnect, I want to revisit this story, and I feel like I'm pulling a rusty nail out of your hand again. So I don't want to dwell on it, but talk a bit about Emphasys. was one of the cooler interventional pulmonary spaces, companies rather, in a space that was really rising at the time, and I think is kind of having a resurgence. But talk about Emphasys, if you would.
Yeah, I'm really proud of the Emphasys story, and it's not a rusty nail.
Good.
I'm,
So Levy, he's bringing it up again. God, this guy.
I'm past. It was a great learning experience for me and a life lesson in a lot of ways. It was one of the most gratifying jobs I've had. We built a great team, a great technology. We're really helping patients. I ran one of the first pivotal trials in that space and had successful outcomes there. And it was a difficult time with the FDA, as you and I spoke about in the past. And people may not remember back, but in the summer of 2008, there were the FDA whistleblowers there were some physicians that thought that the administrators were overruling them. And so they went out and went public, and the administrators got very scared to take on some of the medical advisors there. So it's this very confrontational time within the FDA, and the FDA goes through cycles. And so at the time it was a little more anti-industry, and then this specific group that we had was even more anti-industry, and it didn't work out well for us. So we went to panel. We had
talk about the product for a moment, just because I don't think we've talked about what the product was. No, that's fine. This was a pulmonary valve, right? That you would put in and would allow air to go one way but not the other.
Yeah. So people with emphysema, their alveoli break down, and the lung loses its elasticity or squeeze. So they can inhale, but they can't exhale. And you can kind of simulate this yourself. If you breathe in real deeply and do shallow breaths out and do that for very long, you'll get really winded. And imagine not being able to exhale. It's a miserable feeling. So these people are they've got some healthy lung, but it's being squeezed out by the unhealthy lung. And the theory was you could isolate by putting a one-way valve in the airway that feeds the diseased tissue. The air could evacuate from that valve, but it couldn't go back in. And you'd eventually get that overinflated lung to collapse. And that would allow the functional lung to then expand and breathe more normally. So great idea, and it worked. And we learned a lot in the trial itself. There was a lot of things we didn't know, and we found out there's a phenomenon or a condition called collateral air. So we were trying to empty certain lobes. What we didn't realize at the time, and nobody realized, is that some lobes are isolated. So if you put a valve in an isolated lobe, it'll collapse, and then the surrounding lung will fill in the space. If the lobe isn't completely isolated, there's collateral airways coming in, it'll just keep refilling. And at the time, we're like, why won't this one collapse and this one will?
Interesting.
But we learned, and now in Pulmonx, who acquired the Emphasys assets and has now been very successful with it, they introduced a product that would identify collateral flow so that you can then diagnose it and more precisely target where you put the valves. And it's the standard of care now for that disease.
That's great. And just to revisit the interaction with the FDA again, I'm trying to remember how the committee voted. If you would just quickly share that story again and why it was so significant, because it was a low point, I think, in relations. Looking back now, it looks like night and day to me anyway, as an outsider. I'm hoping you can confirm that.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it was pre Jeff Shuren, who came in, I think, made some radical, favorable, well-needed, much-needed changes. Mm-hmm. And so it's a different era. And yeah, I've got great stories about FDA today. So it's like, it's nice and I can't say enough how well good partners they've been at EBR here and at Soterix. So it's very different. But we went to panel. We had met our endpoints, but there was it was clear that the FDA did not want us to be approved, and made a very strong case at panel, and kind of came at us from all directions. It was a poorly run study. They met the endpoints, but it wasn't clinically significant, and kind of this came at it from all angles. And you only have like 45 minutes to present as a company, and to rebut every allegation was just impossible. And the panel voted us down. And it was shocking, because when you meet your primary endpoints, that's almost unheard of. And in fact, there are companies who miss their primary endpoints and still get approved. And an example of that was asthmatics, who didn't meet their primary endpoints, but then got approved after that. So it sounds like griping when I talk about it, and I don't mean to, but it's just I try to be as factual as possible. Yeah. It was a hard thing to go through. It didn't seem fair at the time. There's a lot of emotion around it. It's a life lesson, and it was a good career lesson. And what I'm proud about is the technology lived on. We did meet the endpoints. It does work clinically. It is good for patients. It's now being deployed and successfully by Pulmonx, and I cheer their success. I follow them, and every time there's good news, I try to do my Twitter or my and really want to see them succeed, because it's something we're really proud of.
That's great, and I think Emphasys was probably one of those stories that led to sort of the introspection to Josh Mackauer's study, to real sort of a concerted effort to try to affect some change at the FDA. So
they took it to heart. They did some introspection after that, and it really changed. So it was I don't know if it was the trigger, but it might have been one of many that really have changed things. And now, as I said, I think the FDA looks at it. They're very rigorous, right? So you can't skate through by being friends. You have to deliver, but it's fair and it's transparent, and they tell you what they want. And if you deliver what they tell you, then everything's good. And so it's very again, transparent is probably the best way to state it.
Right. So just quickly, in between that and this time, you were CEO of Ceterix. Talk just quickly about the company, and you had a successful outcome there as well.
Ceterix was a meniscal repair device. So the knee meniscus is it's the soft cartilage between their femoral head, or your femur and your tibia. And so if you don't have one, you kind of get bone on bone. If it's torn, it's painful. And so the standard of care has always been what they call meniscectomy. They would just trim it and cut it out. There's a lot of euphemisms, but they'll say, well, we're just going to clean up your knee, which means they're shaving the meniscus out. And there's a lot of data that shows that you need your meniscus. Back in the 50s and 60s, they would just take the whole thing out. They would just remove it. And then they saw that led to osteoarthritis, which makes sense. You've got bone on bone, and that meniscus is there to kind of protect it. So more and more they go, well, we'll just do a partial meniscectomy. But partial is in the eye of the beholder. And there's some tipping point where you take too much tissue, and again, you've disrupted the mechanics, and that leads to arthritis. There was also a belief that the meniscus was resistant to healing. There's not a lot of blood supply within the meniscus. On the outside, the periphery of it, it's vascularized, but as you get more central, it gets less and less vascularized. They call that the white zone. So there was a belief in the community, the sports medicine community, that a lot of tears wouldn't heal, and so you just had to do a partial meniscectomy. We didn't believe that because there was literature that showed that it could heal. We believed that it was the methods used to repair it that were the problem, not that it was inherently couldn't heal. We believed if you actually could get a suture around the tear and reduce that tear, stabilize it, that even the non-vascular zone of the meniscus will heal. And I think we ended up proving that. And so we had a mechanism, a device. It was pretty clever. It was a suturing device that would go in the knee. And the difficulty with the meniscus is it's wedged really tightly in your knee. So you're not going to get in there and sew it manually. It's very difficult to do. But we had a suture passer that would go into the knee with just the upper jaw, and it would go on top of the meniscus. And then you'd slide in the lower jaw. So you kind of had it in two motions. And at that point, it's locked into the knee, and you pass the stitches, but then you slide the lower jaw back out, and then you can retract the whole system. And it turns out that you can repair all kinds of tears that were thought to be non-reparable before that. There's a great example. It's called a horizontal cleavage tear, which kind of goes through the center of the meniscus. There's this almost universally believed those didn't heal. And today, I think that's been reversed. And we showed that, in fact, that they can heal. Smith and Nephew was the leader in meniscal repair for other types of tears that were thought to be repairable. And then they've added to their portfolio by acquiring Ceterix so that they can now treat every tear imaginable.
That's great. No, that's a terrific outcome. And you were CEO there for 9 years. Let's get into the EBR story. As we were talking prior to my pushing record, that the company has a longer history, considerably longer than your joining, or considerably prior to your joining in June of 2019. Talk a bit about EBR's origins, if you could, even though you weren't there at the time.
Yeah. So let me just tell you how I got involved, and I'll go to the origins. When I sold Ceterix to Smith and Nephew, I got a call from Alan Will, and Alan's everybody in the audience knows Alan Will. He's a legend. But Alan, I worked for him initially at DVI. He was the president CEO. He was on the board at Emphasys because Emphasys came out of the Foundry, which was an Alan Will company. So now Alan and I have a long association and have worked together in many different ways. So he was interim CEO at the time at EBR. Alan's now at a point in his career where he sits on boards. He's executive chair. That's really what he wants to do. But he found himself as interim CEO, and it was kind of his baby, and he didn't want to give it up to just anybody. And when he knew I was available and he knew my experience at Emphasys on kind of clinical management, he thought I'd be a good fit at EBR. So he called me up and we spoke about that, and I ended up joining him. He's my chairman here now. So I started here in 2019. Now, EBR had been founded in 2003. So it's now a 20-year startup, still not on the market. And you could look at that multiple different ways, say, gee, what's wrong if it's taken that long? But I would assert that EBR was ahead of its time when it started. The technology, it's really sophisticated technology, and I'd love to get into it here. But it was ahead of its time, and there was a lot of development. And I looked at it, this is somewhat maybe selfish in a way, but at the time I got on board, they'd already worked through all the big issues. And the company had already been recapped. So as a CEO, you're looking at the cap table. You don't want to come in with a huge preference stack and a lot of baggage on the cap table. That had already been cleaned up. There was new money in. So it was almost like a Series B company with 15 plus years of R&D work that had gone into it. So for me, it's unfortunate for the early people because they put a lot of blood, sweat, and tears in it and then aren't participating in kind of the success. But for me, coming in at that point, it was a good time because, again, everything had been worked through, and now it was more of an execution phase. And EBR was in the clinical enrollment phase when I started. And again, Alan watched me work at Emphasys and drive the clinical trial there, and knew that I had certain skills in that area.
And EBR also, the FDA granted EBR Systems breakthrough device dezegation the month after you started, right?
Yeah, more or less. Yeah, I can't take credit for that.
I was going to say, you do quick work. Yeah.
So actually, that was my chief regulatory officer, Madhuri Bhatt, who drove that process in 2019. And that's been great. It gives the FDA more latitude to meet with you informally. If there's a queue in terms of submissions, they put you in the front of the queue. And then, of course, there's new technology add-on payment benefits once you get to market. So that's really a big deal, and we're happy to have that. But I came in, it was pre-COVID, just pre-COVID, 2019. We were in the middle of our pivotal trial, and my charter was to get the pivotal trial enrolled. I believe we were shooting for the end of 2020, and we were tracking well. In March of 2020, COVID changed the world, and one by one, sites started shutting down and not doing cases. And it's like, oh my gosh, how are we ever going to get this done? And we haven't talked about what EBR does, but we're in heart failure, and these are really sick patients. So this is advanced heart failure, and we're getting patients that can't be treated any other way. So they're the sickest of the sick.
Let's talk about the product. Yeah, so it's the WISE. It says WISE CRT system.
Yeah, and CRT stands for cardiac resynchronization therapy. It's in the pacemaking space, if you will, cardiac rhythm management. So the big companies in this space are Medtronic, Abbott, Boston Scientific. And pacemakers have different segments. So there's bradycardia, where you would just do the right ventricle pacing or right atrium, right ventricle pacing. There are ICDs, where they actually defibrillate the heart or do a high voltage shock to defibrillate. And those are also on the right side. And then CRT is when you're pacing both the right ventricle and the left ventricle synchronously. And what happens in these patients with heart failure, their left heart gets bigger and bigger, gets distended, it pumps less efficiently, and it's not synchronous with the right ventricle. And so what you do with CRT is you stimulate the left ventricle at the same time, you get it back in synchrony, and it actually reverses the heart failure and shrinks the heart back to more normal, more efficient state. The ejection fraction goes up, their end systolic volume goes down, and the patients feel much better, have better quality of life, and so on. So that's the standard of care, and it works great, but it doesn't always work. And the lead that goes from the can into the left ventricle, it's called a coronary sinus lead for this indication, often can break, can get infected. Sometimes they're not able to get that lead in place. And so we have a leadless system where we take a tiny little pellet, and we say it's the size of a grain of rice, and it literally is like a cooked grain of rice. It's very tiny. And on the end of this little pellet, there's a tines. And we go with the catheter through either the femoral vein or the femoral artery into the left ventricle. And then we push the tines into the wall of the left ventricle, and it retains that little pellet. We call it a receiver electrode. And inside this tiny little capsule or pellet are a series of piezoelectric receivers that take ultrasound energy and convert it to electrical energy. So we resonate it or zap it with ultrasound at a certain frequency that will then elicit a pacing pulse. Do that synchronously with the pacemaker that's on the right side.
So is ultrasound used broadly for this?
No, we're the only company that has a solution like this. So there are leadless pacemakers by Medtronic and Abbott.
Sure.
Boston's has one in development, but they're different. They're self-contained. So they have batteries in them. They're self-contained pacemakers, and they're small, but they're still about 20 times larger than our device. And because of the size difference, they're not suitable for the left ventricle. The left ventricle it's the arterial circulation, so it goes to the brain and the coronaries. And if there's any thrombus formed, you run the risk of increased strokes and embolic events. And so they're only indicated for the right ventricle. Ours is so tiny, it gets completely ingrown in tissue. It gets endothelialized within a matter of about 30, 45 days.
Wow.
So there's no chance that it's going to generate any clots, and so it becomes inert. And then we have an ultrasound transmitter that's placed subcutaneously to power that little pellet.
Gotcha.
So the fact that it's powered remotely lets us make it so small. And that's the secret sauce, or why we can place it in the left ventricle. So there's no other device like this that you can pace within the left ventricle, and that has a lot of clinical advantages.
So how frequently does one need to pace the left ventricle? Is it a gaping hole in that treatment paradigm that we're unable to do that right now, or is it a very small subset of patients who require that?
Well, it's a large niche, I would say. So we estimate it to be a $2.1 billion market opportunity for us. So it's not small, and so that it's a large market opportunity. And when they can't treat those patients, there's no other option. They're either going to go on to an LVAD, a heart transplant, or they're just going to be miserable and continue to decline. There's nothing else they can do. And these are specific type of patients it's heart failure with reduced ejection fraction. And then they also have an electrical signal where their QRS signal on the EKG is lengthened. And so that's a signal that they're having this synchronous activation of the right and left ventricles. And those patients really benefit from this.
Will there be, once approved, opportunities for treating patients with only your device, or is it usually done in conjunction with another pacemaker on the other side of the heart?
So initially, it would always have what we call a co-implant, another.
Co-implant.
We do have visions for standalone, but that would take some more technological advancements, and so those are kind of pipeline issues that wouldn't be an early indication. And the reason we got the breakthrough designation is that our target patient population doesn't have any other option. So the other nice thing is we're not competing with any of these large incumbents. We're not trying to take share from Medtronic or Abbott or Boston. We're actually complementary with their systems. And what's really exciting is if you follow the success of Medtronic's Micra or Abbott's Aveir, their leadless pacemakers, they've been wildly successful. Many of those will need to be upgraded to biventricular pacing, meaning that someday those patients will need left ventricle pacing. We can pair up with the Micra or the Aveir, and then you have completely leadless biventricular pacing, which is really exciting to a lot of our investigators and clinicians.
So where are you now with your clinical trial enrollment and progress, and what's your projection for hopefully getting positive results that you can take to the FDA?
Yeah, well, the good news is we've announced our positive results. So we've completed our enrollment and follow-up, and we released our results at the Heart Rhythm Society meeting this year in May. It was held in New Orleans.
Oh, okay, great.
And we met. We far exceeded our expectations and met our primary endpoints. We had a co-primary endpoint, safety and efficacy, and significantly at a p-value of 0.003 on one side and less than 0.001 on the other side, met both endpoints. So we're kind of off to the races now in terms of getting our final PMA submissions. We're doing a modular submission, so we've got several more modules to go. But we expect to get, it's hard to predict the approval timelines, but sometime maybe end of 2024, roughly, plus or minus, and then off to the market. And then in the interim, I mentioned to you off mic that we also went public in ASX in almost 2 years ago, November of 21, to help capitalize the company.
Talk about ASX and why did you choose that route?
So it was somewhat opportunistic. I mentioned the company had been recapped before I started. So that was in 2017. It turns out that the investors that came in 2017 were Australian private investors. So there were two big venture companies, one called Brandon Capital and the other MH Carnegie and Associates. And behind them, their limited partners are the big superannuation funds in Australia. So I don't know if people are familiar with that term, but they're kind of government mandated retirement funds. Everybody in Australia contributes to a superannuation fund, and then they're pension funds essentially, and then they invest. So we happen to have on our register a number of the very large superannuation funds in Australia. So when we were talking about raising capital in 2021, they were kind of keen on us testing the market since they already, a lot of the public investors were already investors in EBR. So we did a Test the Waters roadshow in June of 21 that went really well. And it was still I say roadshow, it was a Zoom roadshow, still COVID era. And then Alan and I did the actual pitches, the roadshow pitches. And again, not like the old days, the traditional roadshows where you're in and out of airplanes and Ubers and going kind of location. We sat at our desks for hours and hours a day, it was evening because it was Australia. So we'd have to stay up late at night, do the pitches, and we successfully got out and listed in November of 2021. It was a great way to raise capital. They've been great supporters, and we just did a secondary placement in June. So we're very well capitalized to execute on our plan, get through the PMA process, and get to commercialization.
One never knows, of course, how these stories are going to play out, but what are some possible options for EBR in terms of there's obviously value for you to remain independent and sort of working with the Abbotts and the others out there who have their own compatible systems. Certainly you could be acquired by one of those larger companies. Do you have a path that you think makes most sense for not only for EBR shareholders, but also for the space?
Yeah. So my philosophy, every time I am in a CEO role, my philosophy is the same, is that I want to build a sustainable company. So I don't ever think about planning for a sale or planning for acquisition. Now, those two activities may be the same. Planning for a sustainable company may make it an attractive target. So I just want to maintain optionality. You can't really control when somebody wants to buy you. What I can control is whether we're going to be a successful organization. So the options for us are we stay and thrive on ASX. That's our public market, and we have enough capital and we become profitable and stay there. We could dual list. There's companies that stay on ASX and then list on NASDAQ, and then we could be acquired. So those are the three possibilities that I imagine is, staying independent, public, either ASX and NASDAQ, or at some point perhaps getting acquired. It is a natural fit for the big three, and but we can't project if and when that would happen.
All right. Well, we'll be tracking the story for sure. And John, it's great to reconnect with you, and thanks for sharing your many experiences in medtech.
Thanks, Tom. Looking forward to the next time.
All right, well, that is a wrap. Thanks again for joining us on the Device Talks Weekly podcast. Please make sure you register for Device Talks West, happening October 18th and 19th. Seriously, it's going to be a great 2 days. Super valuable, super powerful, super enjoyable, and super affordable. $695 for 2 days of event and a networking session on top of that. So make sure you join us. Go to devicetalks.com. While you're there, check out all of our Device Talks Podcast Network podcasts. And if you'd like to have them sent directly to you, make sure you subscribe to the Device Talks Podcast Network. Please share this episode of the Device Talks Weekly Podcast on your on your social media channels. And when you do, connect with me. I am Tom, Salemi. And even if you don't share, please connect with me on LinkedIn, Tom, Salemi. I would love to have more connections. Would be great to connect with folks out there. So please just take 15 seconds to find me on LinkedIn and push connect. And I will connect right back and give you a little note thanking you for connecting with me, because I really am grateful when more folks reach out. So please do find me on LinkedIn. You can also find my podcast partner, Chris Newmarker, there. Chris, as in a Newmarker, he's executive editor of Life Sciences. So that is a wrap. Again, we'll have a Stryker Talks for you next week, more Device Talks Weeklies. And I hope to see you at Device Talks West. And I hope to hear from you at our upcoming Device Talks Tuesdays. Thanks very much, everyone. Have a great week.